Welcome to Northridge Church. We're glad to have you here. We're in our second week of our Frequently Asked Questions series, and you should have received a program on your way in. You may want to follow that along. It may help you a little bit as we talk through a lot of information today. We've been using the NIV translation of the Bible for over a decade now, and Zondervan announced 2.5, maybe 3 years ago that they're coming out with a new edition. As every Bible translation comes up with a second edition, none of them are still on their first edition, except perhaps the Holman. That might be new enough that it is. But they all come out with second and third editions as things change, as English changes, as scholarship changes. So the NIV is coming out with a new edition in 2011, and that has gone through a massive amount of controversy. It has received a large degree of criticism, and so that really 2.5 years ago, that criticism began, and that grabbed our attention here, because you would think typically, okay, one edition's going out, we'll just start with the new edition. And here's the thing, we don't want to keep using the 84 edition because that's no longer going to be sold in bookstores. Once the inventory's gone, they're not making it anymore. So we have to decide what we're going to do. We want people to be able to hold the same translation that we teach from in their hands. So that began a process for us, and the high degree of criticism really grabbed our attention. And so here's the deal. I'm taking some license as the lead pastor here. Week number 2 of our series on Frequently Asked Questions is going to be a question no one has yet asked, but they will. We are going to be changing translations, and we're going to be moving to the new edition of the NIV, the 2011 edition. And so we're going to answer a question that no one has yet asked, but I know they will. And so there's a couple of reasons that I'm going to do this today. It seems to fit. We just talked about translations last week, so we've been waiting to talk about this for a while. Secondly, when people do ask, and they will ask in the coming weeks and months and years why we chose this, we want to point to a place on our website they can look at it. And also, if you've got believing friends, Christian friends, who follow Christian blogs, who keep up to date at all in what the popular debates are in evangelical Christianity, this is one of the 1 or 2 hottest ones. So you'll probably hear. And actually, technically, there will be some people that will make judgments on us for choosing this. So this is really an insider talk. We're all about more and better disciples here. This is really focused on those who are already followers of Jesus. Again, I want to try to do it in a way that doesn't bore anyone that's here, but I want to talk about this 2011, what the controversy is all about, and why we've decided what we have decided. And again, hopefully in a way that will draw your interest in, not bore you. I want to remind you of some things we talked about last week, just as a review, because we're going to refer to them. There's really 4 issues that make a good translation. They're issues of, is it accurate? Is it clear? Is it natural? Is it audience appropriate? And those are all important, and every translation is striving for those as much as possible. But the problem is those are going to be in conflict. There's going to be times that accuracy is going to be in conflict with clarity, and the accuracy is going to be in conflict with how natural it sounds and feels to its readers. So these are constant struggles. Remember the issue of translation. There's really 2 issues involved. There's a donor language, the language in which it was originally written, and there's a receptor language, the language you're translating into. It is not simply finding out what this word meant and turn it into this language as that same word. It just doesn't work that way, because it's not just words. It's phrases, it's figures of speech, there's grammar, there's syntax, there's a culture, there's a context, there's a genre. Taking all of that in the donor language and figuring out the most accurate, clear, natural way to say that in the receptor language, in a totally different language, a totally different culture, context, genre perhaps, syntax, language, grammar. So that's the challenge. So these are going to be sometimes they are often going to fight against each other. And it's a tension that all translators have to work through. So you want it to be accurate. You want it to be an accurate translation. Here's what Paul said. Can we say it that same way in a receptor language? You also want it to be clear, not just accurate, but clear. Does it make sense? If it's put into English, but it doesn't make sense when you read it, then that's no good. So you want to make sure it's not just accurate, but also clear. The goal would be also that it's natural. A big thing we got to remember, and one of the common comments I heard last week is some people enjoy their translation because it just sounds right. It sounds like the Bible. And just a reminder that when people heard the Bible, when it was written to them, it sounded like their everyday language. So the example I used last week was Acts chapter 11, where in the ESV it says, the report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem. That's accurate. And it's clear. That's very understandable. It's not natural. No one would say the report of that came to my ears in 21st century English. The NIV makes it a little clear with news instead of report of this. News reached the ears. They kept that figure of speech. The NLT just went for to make it as natural as possible when the church at Jerusalem heard what happened. All three of those translations are good ones. This is a non-debated one. I think all of them are accurate. All of them are clear. The NLT is the most natural. There are going to be places, though, where to make it sound natural, you're really flirting with the line of, are we even being accurate anymore? So those are the three issues. And the fourth issue is audience appropriate. You have to decide who your audience is. Is your audience non-churchgoers or new believers or mature believers who grew up reading the Bible? Is it children or is it adults? Is it people for whom English is a second language? Who is your target? And that impacts your theory of translation. So these things, we talked about it last week, and we'll talk more about this whole problem of how to choose if something is accurate or clear. Which do you go with? How do you handle those? Those are hard choices. So also last week, we talked about when it comes to the translation you choose, it really comes down to four issues, 2 facts and 2 choices. The first fact is that every translation interprets, every single one. There's no translation that doesn't interpret. And let me say it this way. If you pick a word in English that is not just a simple word like walk, if there's some substance to it where there's different nuances of meaning, you look it up in an English dictionary, it'll say it could mean this, it'll give option number 2 or 3. It might have 5 or 6 different options of the context. It may mean differently depending on the context. Well, if you're translating that word, then it becomes interpretation. Which one of those meanings fits the context best, and how can I best translate that meaning into a new word in this receptor language? So I tried to make that real clear last week. Every translation interprets. If you don't think that your translation interprets, then you probably don't understand how language really, really works. Secondly, no translation is perfect, not one. Because every translation interprets, it's not going to be perfect. And there's going to be times where you have to say, okay, maybe I would have looked at it this way, and that's why I encouraged you last week to own more than one translation. And then that's fact number 2. Choice number 1 is older versus more. That you have to decide, and what we talked about with this last week is if the Bible was written, if it finished being written in about 100 AD or in the early 90s, let's say, there's manuscripts that are a few dozen years after that. Do you want those manuscripts? It's only about 10% of the manuscripts, but they're very recent from the original writings, but it's 10%. Or would you prefer the more writings, that it's about 90%, but they are the first manuscript, the first piece of a manuscript appears maybe 800 AD, but most of the manuscripts appear like 1,000 to 1,400 years after they were originally written. And so depending on what you choose in older versus more will determine what family of manuscript you go with. The King James and the New King James go with more and younger manuscripts. The rest of the translations we talked about last week focused on the older, even though there's less of them. The second issue, the second choice is the issue of formal translation versus functional translation. And there's a sliding scale here from most formal to most functional. Those that want a formal translation, they're trying to say, let's keep the form of the original language, the donor language, as much as possible, as long as it's understandable. A functional translation, the goal isn't that it's just understandable. The goal is that it's natural. And then there's a mediating theory, and that is that the goal is that it's clear. So the goal of a formal translation is that you keep the form as long as it's understandable. May not be clear or natural, but it's understandable. A mediating translation, clarity is the goal. And then when it comes to a functional translation, the goal is that it's natural. And those are the choices that are made. And we talked about last week, there is no such thing as a completely word-for-word translation. It would be not comprehensible to us in English. And we use this scale that Rod Decker created of just showing the different options when it comes to formal. The most form would be the NASB probably, then the King James, New King James, ESV, and then the HCSB. Functional translation, my favorite, is the New Living, and then the mediating would be the NIV. And the NIV 11 is slightly more functional, and it also, at the same time, is more accurate in many, many cases. We'll talk a little bit about that. So we had to begin, when this news came out 2.5 years ago, how the NIV 11 was going to be published, they were going to cancel the 84, and there were a lot of people complaining loudly about it. We had to begin choosing, well, what translation might we use? And let me just walk you through very briefly a couple of year journey for us. We knew we didn't want to go with the New Living Translation, that's really good for a read-through, but it's not good for in-depth study. That I love it for a read-through. I used it 5 or 6 years ago as a read-through the Bible, but it's not the kind of thing, and even those translators will tell you, this is for a public reading of Scripture, or just a straight-through reading of Scripture. It is not for in-depth study. It's very functional. That's not what we'd want to use on Sunday morning. It's not what we want to use in our small groups. It's not what we'd want you to use if you're doing an in-depth study of verses and phrases and words. Of course, we're not going to use the NIV. That's going to no longer be published, and we want people to be able to purchase the very Bible that we're going to use. Because we side with older versus more, that takes out the King James and the New King James. We took out the HCSB because it sounds like a bank. No, that's not why. That's not why. We took that one out, although it really came down to those four, and I really like all four of these. These are four that I would feel comfortable using and preaching from and studying from. But we took out the Holman Christian Standard Bible primarily because it is one denomination's translation. And I think when it's one denomination's translation, there's a danger there of them interpreting theologically. And I think that's our job as pastors and as theologians and lay theologians. It's not the job of translators, or they could end up in the desire to stick tight to their theology. They could choose to interpret in a way that maybe isn't always most fair. So I try to avoid denominational translations. We eliminated the NASB because the ESV is just slightly more functional, so it really came down to these two, and there probably was a good 1.5 years where there were some discussions, and I thought about these two translations and read them a lot. We did end up deciding to go with the NIV 2011. I want to walk you through some of the issues involved. Now, I also want to point you to some resources. There's a couple of books that may be helpful. I mentioned them, I think, last week. Let me show them to you. How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth. I think that's going to be really helpful. If what we talked about last week and this week really interests you, I would urge you to get this book. We sell it in our bookstore. You can buy it online. It's an excellent book. It might be 150 pages. It's a pretty easy read. It's written for laymen. You don't need to know Greek and Hebrew to be able to follow this thing. And then when it comes to the issue of the King James debate that's out there, this is a book that I've really appreciated by D.A. Carson called The King James Version Debate, A Plea for Realism. Also tomorrow morning, I plan to tomorrow morning post 6 or 7 links to articles that were helpful to me in the last year or 1.5 years in this whole process. So if you check my blog, if you receive my blog via email, and you want to read more about some of these translations or theories or criticism surrounding the NIV 2011, you could check that out tomorrow. Now, when it comes to this issue, let me talk about the criticism and what the two primary issues are. Let's talk about the critics first. There's 3 or 4 primary critics of the 2011 NIV. One is the Southern Baptists are very critical of the 2011 NIV. In fact, last year at their national convention, a motion was taken from the floor condemning or saying it shouldn't be used by Southern Baptist churches, and it was a motion that passed. And so when an entire denomination votes against a translation, that gets people's attention. And that's what the Southern Baptists did. Now, I don't think it wasn't from their resolution committee. It wasn't from their leadership. It was, if you know how denominational meetings work, it was a resolution that was presented from the floor by a single pastor, seconded, very briefly debated, and voted, and it passed. So that received a lot of news, and people have followed that. Now, it's interesting, Lifeway Bookstore, which is the official Southern Baptist bookstore, they ignore that resolution. They still carry the NIV 2011 in their bookstore. But that did get a lot of media attention. The second reason or place they received a lot of criticism is from 2 particular publishers have been very critical of the 2011 NIV. What taints their criticism in my mind a little bit is each of those publishing companies also have their own translation that they publish. I think as soon as you get into that, it draws you back just a little bit. You know what I mean? When they have their own translation that they want out there, they went after the big dog, which is the NIV. And then the third group are those who are the biggest fans of the ESV. And this has been the loudest criticism and the most influential criticism. Now, here's the deal. We get a lot of criticism around here, and we usually don't respond to criticism, or that's what you just end up doing all the time, is responding to criticism. But here's the deal. Those that are being most critical of the 2011 NIV are in our camp theologically. So that makes us slow down and pause and ask a lot of questions. If they're in our camp theologically and they're that critical of the 2011 NIV, I better pay attention. And if you're familiar with ESV fans, and I love the ESV, it is one of my two favorite translations, but ESV fans are kind of like Mac users. See, I don't even have to explain that. That you don't just casually use a Mac typically. You love your Mac. And everyone else should love your Mac. And you tell people, if you use this for 5 minutes, you'd never go back. And I'm telling you, that's the kind of phrase you hear from Mac users and ESV readers. They're that fanatical, and that's okay. I love that. And a lot of it has to do with the influence of John Piper and the whole young, restless, and reform movement. A lot of guys in their 20s and 30s follow this very strongly, and I'm all good with that. So when good groups, and there's also this council, can't remember the name of it, this Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood that really has gotten involved and put their foot in the door and said, hey, we got to think about this. So you just need to know that the reason I take this seriously, the NIV has always taken hits, always. But now it's people in our own theological circles that are the loudest of the criticism, so that causes us to stop and think through this. Now, let me tell you the two issues surrounding the criticism. And then in explaining these two issues, we'll get into it. The first issue has to do with functional translation versus formal translation. And that really is a loud criticism that's been dealt with. That's the same criticism these same groups have given since the NIV was first published way back in 1978. And that was what most of last Sunday was about, so we're not going to reiterate that. So the criticism you will read and hear about the NIV has to do with functional versus formal translation. And I go back to what I said yesterday. There's several reasons we chose the NIV, and that's what we would do again in that situation. That I don't think there's a word-for-word translation that's readable or accurate or helpful, and we have to consider who that audience is. But here's the second issue, and this is where the debate occurs. The second issue is around translation of gender. So here's the criticism towards the 2011 NIV, that if you read much, this is what you'll read very quickly. That in Greek, there are nouns and pronouns that are clearly masculine nouns and pronouns. And when they get translated into the new NIV, they don't get translated in a masculine form. They end up being gender neutral. Is that accusation accurate? It is. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Why did they choose that? Was it a good or a bad choice? When we think about these issues, I really want to encourage you to try to think through what does the Bible say, and then think through the issues of donor language and receptor language. Now, the differences. Let me talk about the differences between the 2011 and the 1984 edition of the NIV. It's 95% total agreement. There's 5% changes in the two translations between 84 and 2011. And the committee has written as to what those changes were. So there were three things that brought those changes. Let me show them to you on the screen. Number one, changes in English. Number two, progress in scholarship. Number three, concern for clarity. That's in your notes. You might want to write that down. There's three primary issues: changes in English, progress in scholarship, concern for clarity. And I want to try to talk about each of these very briefly so that you can have a full-orbed understanding of the issues around this translation. Let me start with alien. There's a word that appears 111 times in the 1984 edition of the NIV, and it's the word alien. In the 2011, I think the word alien doesn't exist at all, and here's the reason. that primarily because of changes in English, alien primarily to people now means like E.T. It means extraterrestrial. And so they simply have done a simple change. So here's 111 of the changes. They changed it from alien to foreigner because that's just clear. That's a change in English. Before, alien movies and TV shows were more popular. Alien, if you ask someone back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s what an alien was, they might say a foreigner. Today, you'd rarely hear. If you say alien, people typically think of E.T. So let me show you an example of this. Genesis 19. Get out of our way, they replied. This is the 84 version of the NIV. This fellow came here as an alien, and now he wants to play the judge. The 2011 NIV is identical except for one word change. They changed alien to foreigner. That's the only difference. That's about a change in English that the translators would say alien has taken a different nuance of meaning in 2011 than it did in 1970s when the NIV was first published. Here's another example. Let me show you another verse. Isaiah 16. We have heard of Moab's pride, her overweening pride and conceit. Now, here's what the NIV translators would say. If it's not a word that a large majority of English-speaking people would immediately know what it means, maybe we should at least try to find a word that makes a little more sense. And I doubt many of you in here used overweening this morning in your conversation. Some of you are saying, I don't even know what that means. Well, so the 2011 just changed up the wording a little bit, and they changed it from overweening pride to arrogance. That it's beyond pride. It's an overdone pride. They called it arrogance. So those are some examples of just how you take change. There's some changes in English, words that were common that aren't as common anymore. The second issue that involved changes from the 1984 edition to 2011 is progress in scholarship. That there continues to be. Anytime you have an ancient language that people are studying so much, there's always progress that's being made. And that progress at times can be slow and it can be quick, and there can be an understanding of a word. There are words that the only place we know of them in ancient literature is in the Greek New Testament. Sometimes we find those words in new documents, and when we read those, it helps us understand a context and how other ways that people use that word. That's a progress in scholarship. Now, they state it very positively. I would also state this is where they corrected a lot of mistakes from the 1984 edition. And this is actually, if I had to choose between the 84 NIV and the 2011, I'd choose the 2011 because I think they made a lot of improvements, a vast amount of improvements. They might put it under scholarship. I would put it under some bad translation in 84. Let me show you one example that I don't want to camp on of a common verse, arpegmon, which is translated, and you may be familiar with this from Philippians, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery, is how arpegmon was translated in the King James. The NIV said something to be grasped. The ESV translated it very similar, a thing to be grasped. As I understand, and I'm not real familiar with this particular word, but some progress in scholarship has led scholars in the Greek New Testament to say a better understanding of that word would be used to his own advantage. That's a more recent scholarship advancement. So they changed the translation. And there's a lot of those examples. So there's changes in English, there's progress in scholarship, and then the third example of changes would be concern for clarity. And this is going to be the debated one. Those first two aren't going to be debated by other translations. This is going to be the one that's going to take some heat. So the best way to do it is to give you some examples. Let me show you one here. Matthew 1:16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. That's the 84 edition. Now let me ask you this question. I want you to think through this. This phrase, of whom, that pronoun, of whom, who does that refer to? What's the antecedent? And there's several ways to look at it. There's grammatically, there's contextually, and there's theologically. Now, theologically, we know of whom was born Jesus. That refers to who, theologically? Mary, absolutely. If you read all of Matthew 1, though, if you consider this of whom in the English Bible, you will find that it's always speaking man to man, a man to a son, man to son, man to son. So if you look at the context of Matthew 1, someone who knows no theology could read this and think, oh, well, that certainly refers to Joseph, because in the first 15 verses, it always refers to the dad, that pronoun. But when you look at it linguistically, language-wise, English, who does that refer to? That could refer to Mary, it could refer to Joseph, it could refer to Mary and Joseph, depending on the context. Now, okay, in the next 10 minutes, you are going to learn more about pronouns than you've ever wanted to know in your life. And if you missed it in 7th grade, we're going to make it up for it right now. Now, of whom? Let's talk about that particular pronoun. Is that pronoun, does that refer to masculine? Is that a masculine pronoun or feminine, or it could be either? Which is it? Either, right? Of whom could be referring to, it could be a feminine, that it's antecedent, a masculine antecedent, or it could be either one or both. When you use of whom, is it singular or plural, or could it be either? It could be either. This is really important. And this issue, there's going to be 2 or 3 things that I'm going to say that are going to help clear up a lot of issues for you, I hope, surrounding this translation. In English, when you use the word whom, it could be feminine or masculine antecedent. It could be singular or plural. We don't know. If you've taken another language, then this won't surprise you. In many, if not most other languages, pronouns are very specifically masculine or feminine, singular or plural. Now, here's what you wouldn't know reading any English translation that's formal. You wouldn't know that of whom is a feminine, singular pronoun. So who does that very clearly refer to? Mary. Jesus is the son of Mary. So the NIV 2011 translates it this way. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who's called the Messiah. Now, this is going to bring back last week's debate all over, and I want you to think through this. Which one of those is, if you're talking literal, okay, I'm not talking accurate, if you're talking literal, which one of those is most literal? Well, I would say this is, and this is how the ESV and King James would translate it. Which one is most accurate? Because the English language doesn't stipulate a pronoun being masculine or feminine, singular or plural, I think, and I doubt many of you would argue, that actually the most accurate translation is the one that clearly identifies who that pronoun refers to. So in this case, the reason the NIV was changed is because, for sake of clarity, let's be really clear who Jesus was born to. It was not Joseph. Joseph is not the father of Jesus. He's his stepdad, certainly. That's an issue of clarity. Let me show you another one. Philippians 4. Here is one of the most loved verses in the New Testament and one of the most misused verses in the New Testament. It says this, NIV, I can do everything through him who gives me strength, or ESV, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I think the King James, that's what I learned. It's still what comes through my mind. I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth. I love that word, strengtheneth me. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean I can win the Heisman through him who gives me strength? I don't think that. I can fly through him who gives me strength. I can get accepted to Harvard through him who... And I'm telling you, do you understand? This is one of the most misused verses in all of the Bible. Well, here's what people forget when they... And I could ask you, and probably a majority of us would flunk this quiz. Without looking at Philippians 4, would any of you be able to tell me what the context of Philippians 4 is about? And the answer is contentment. The verses right before, Paul talks about, I've learned to have a lot and I've learned to have nothing. I've learned to be content in whatever state I am, with much, with nothing. I've learned to be content. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, and I think it's good that you're sharing in my suffering, is the next verse. There's a very clear context to that. But people have this tendency to rip a verse out of context and use it to mean all kinds of crazy, crazy things. So, the NIV 2011, for the sake of clarity, helps us a little bit by stating it this way. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. If you want to accurately interpret Philippians 4:13, understand this. You have the ability to be content in whatever circumstances God has placed you in by him who gives you the strength to do it. That's what that verse means. And for the sake of clarity, they translated it this way. Now let me say this, so I don't want to get off topic on this. But I think there are a lot of other applications. But I think those applications have to fit the context of, here's a situation in life in which God has placed me, and he's given me an expectation of which I'm to fulfill. That I can do through Christ who gives me strength. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of people misusing. So that's a little bit of an example. And there's plenty of other examples that we could use of concern for clarity. One that comes to mind is the translation of the word saint. Hagios in Greek is translated saint. You're not going to find saint very often, if ever, in the 2011 NIV. And here's the reason. The literal translation of hagios is holy ones or set apart ones. In Old English, the word that clearly meant set apart ones, holy ones who are different, is saints. In 21st century English, for clarity, the NIV translator said, most people when they hear saint, the average person, English speaker, thinks honored dead Catholic. And that's not what the Bible means when it uses the word saint. So the NIV 2011 just said, okay, what does that word mean? And you look up in any Greek dictionary, you'll see hagios means set apart ones. So the NIV 2011 doesn't use the word saints because they think that's not really clear to most people. Let's make it really clear to readers of the Bible. So they simply translate that God's people, the Lord's people. That's one that's not very hotly debated. So those are the three issues that brought changes, and 95% is different. 5% is different. 95% is identical. Now, here's what we need to do, though. We need to get into the controversial issues. That's what people will talk about. That there's these issues of gender and what gender means. So when I talk about gender, there's an extreme. One extreme with gender would say, when you see God the Father in the New Testament, you should translate that God the Father and Mother. That's not what we're talking about. Let me give you the other extreme. Here's the other extreme. That any time a masculine noun or pronoun is in Greek, it should always be translated masculine in English. And that doesn't sound extreme, and I wouldn't view that as extreme, but it is the other extreme from calling God Father and Mother. But just know this. I'll say this at the beginning to tell you where I'm going. Not one translation, not one, always translates masculine nouns and pronouns masculine in English. But that's the criticism that it gets. So let me walk you through this briefly. Hopefully it'll make some sense. Let me show you the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3 says this. See to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. That's the NIV 1984. So let me ask you this. The writer of Hebrews, was he only concerned that men not have sinful, unbelieving hearts? Is that what he means? Or do you think he means everybody? Is he saying, I don't care if women have sinful, unbelieving hearts. I'm just concerned about the men. Of course not. Of course not. So let me show you how the NIV translates this, and this is what a large majority of the criticism is about. Here's how they translate it. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. Let me give you the typical argument and the one that might be coming to your mind right now, and then we'll talk about it. Typically, someone might say, well, wait a minute. If it says brothers in Greek, why don't we translate it that way in English? And I think there's a couple of different reasons why. Let me start with, I think, an issue of a translation issue. Let me put up the Greek word. I don't like to do this a lot, but let me put up the Greek word for you. Adelphoi is what that says. Singular, it's adelphos. Now, every time, or almost every time, in most of the formal translations in the 84 NIV, when adelphoi appears, they almost always, if not every time, translate it brothers. Now, let me tell you that if you look at a Greek lexicon, there's actually three different definitions or three different explanations of what adelphoi means. And if you could capture this, if you follow me for the next 2 minutes, we're going to dive deep here. If you can follow this for the next couple of minutes, I think a lot of the controversy around the NIV will make sense to you. Because this is probably the best example I can give you. The first option is that it means male siblings. So let me ask you this. When the writer of Hebrews said, brothers, see to it that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart, was he only talking to his male siblings? Yes or no? Of course not. He's not writing a letter to everybody, but he's only addressing this command to his relative brothers. Here's option number 2, siblings. This is a huge difference between Greek and English. In Greek, they will use the word adelphoi to speak to all siblings, brothers and sisters. We don't do that in English. We say, hey, get your brothers and sisters. If I had all the Bixby's, the Bixby brothers are down here. So let's imagine I had all 5 of the Bixby children up here. 2 boys, 3 girls. If in 21st century English I said, hey, brothers, come here, I want to show you something. You know what happened? Adam and Noah would follow me, right? But Elise, Sophia, Olivia, they would stay there because I said brothers. Here's what you got to know. If it was first century Greek and I said, Adelphoi, come here, I want to show you something, the context would have to determine if I'm only speaking to Adam and Noah or if I'm also speaking to Olivia, Sophie, and Elise. Does that make sense? If I said to them, hey, brothers, Adelphoi, come here, I want to show all of you something, they would know the context meant I meant all of them. When you stop and simply consider that, when people are critical, where in Hebrews 3:12 they translate it brothers and sisters, I would suggest that's a touch too critical. That it actually is understanding of what adelphoi actually can mean. But there's a third translation option, and it's this: people in a close bond or association. So when the writer of Hebrews says, brothers, see to it that none of you has a sinful and unbelieving heart, which of those 3 definitions is he clearly by context using? The third one. And that could mean women or men or both. So here's what the NIV 2011 translators did. Every time they found adelphoi, they literally stopped and said, is he speaking only to male siblings? And that happens. Jesus, they tell Jesus, hey, your mother and brothers are out here to see you. That was this usage. There's times where Jesus says, you must reject your sisters and your brothers. He meant this, literal brothers. And at times, he uses adelphoi for everyone, all the brothers. Peace to the brothers. When Paul says that, peace to the brothers, he's not saying, I wish peace to the brothers and, judgment to the girls. Of course not, right? He's using it in this way. People in a close bond or association. He does that over and over and over. So, you'll find, I think it's only 9 times in the NIV 2000 or the 1984 edition, sisters. The word sisters is only found 9 times. It's found like 117 in the 2011. Why? Because every time it was used by this third definition, they felt, and I agree, that the most accurate and clear and natural interpretation was to say brothers and sisters. And I'm telling you, this is what the debate with each one. The second debate has to do with pronouns. Let me just show you a random passage here, Galatians 6. I literally just picked this randomly this week. This is in the 84 edition. I need to do this quickly. Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him. Notice all the male pronouns. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. And this is where you stop and ask yourself, is Paul only concerned with men deceiving themselves or not? Because, and let me just jump to the chase here on this, pronouns are the same. The default pronoun in Greek language is masculine. That's really, really important. The default pronoun, if you're talking about men or women or all combined, the default pronoun is masculine. So he says, each one of you should test his own actions, then he could take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. Each one should carry his own load. Anyone who receives instruction in the word must share all good things with his instructor. The NIV 2011 said the default pronoun in Greek is always masculine. What is it in English? So they changed it to this. Verses 1 through 6, brothers and sisters. And I put in red every one that's a change. You who live by the Spirit should restore that person. Jump ahead to verse 3. If anyone thinks they are something when they are nothing, they deceive themselves, not he, him. Their own. When they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else, they should carry their own load. And then verse 6 ends with saying they should share all good things with their instructor. Now, again, let me say this. This is the other time we're going to dive deep for about 2 minutes. But if you catch this, you will understand a majority of the controversy around 2011. The natural default pronoun in Greek is masculine. What is it in English? Now, I'm going to give you a quiz. Ready? Everybody's going to take a quiz, so everybody has to raise their hand. You have to help me make sure that everybody near you votes, all right? That's your job, including yourself. Here's the question. How would you fill this in? Get your exam from your instructor. When finished, return it to blank. Now, let's say this is a standard exam that you get, maybe a driver's exam. So you don't know if it's a man or woman instructor. So I want to ask you, here's your 4 options. Don't raise your hand yet. I'll re-ask. Let me give you the 4 options first. Some of you would say, when finished, get your exam from your instructor. When finished, return it to him. Some of you, that's what you naturally would say. Number 2, some of you might say, get your exam from your instructor. When finished, return it to her. Some of you might naturally say that. Here's option 3. When finished, return it to him, her. You literally would write that, or him or her. And then the 4th option would be, get your exam from your instructor. When finished, return it to them. Okay, ready to vote? In English, if that was the question, get your exam from your instructor. When finished, return it to, how many of you would just naturally say, return it to him? Okay, how many would say, return it to her? Wow, okay. How many would say, and you'll find that that's true by a test that's been given, how many would say return it to him/her or him or her? Okay, and how many would say return it to them? Okay, that's a majority. Now, those that raise their hand at the end, raise your hand again if you just raise your hand, and turn to your neighbor that's not raising their hand and said, I'm smarter than you. Go ahead. Good. Now, okay, no, you're not, but let me show you. This is how seriously the NIV translators took this issue. That they actually found a report, a Collins report of written English. And in 1990, here's what they discovered. Look at this chart. See if you can interpret this. When there was a neutral antecedent like instructor, in English in 1990, what percentage would they use each of those words? Here's what they discovered. 2% of the time they would use her. About 12% of the time, they would use him/her. 22% of the time, they would say him. And then some of you struggle with. But wait, that's a singular antecedent, and this is a plural pronoun. Right. And here's what I say to you. Get over it. All right? Because it has become acceptable in standard English. And if you're an English teacher from years, this is really bothering you. I know it is. And that's why you don't like the new NIV, for that reason right there. But actually, it has become, it now is standard that it is allowed to have disagreement between an antecedent and a pronoun. They ran this was 1990. Watch the difference. 64% now. They ran this same test 3 years ago. Here are the results. It has changed to 1% her. Him, her has gone from 12 down to 8%, and him has gone from 22% to less than 8%. And now 83% of English written plural, it's them. So here's what the translators of the NIV did. They simply said, wait a minute, how would people say that today? In the Greek language, of course they would use him or he, because that's the default pronoun, no matter who you're talking about, if it's generic in any sense. Now, let me show you, and I gotta end this, but let me show you the most controversial verse in the new NIV. If you read any articles against the 2011 NIV, this will be the issue. You ready? Here it is. 1 Timothy 2:12 says this. Go to the next one. 1 Timothy 2:12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. That's the 1984 edition. Here's how the 2011 translates it. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, just so you know, and I'm not making fun of the huge controversy over this translation. And some of you are saying, seriously? Seriously. And here's what the opponents of the 2011 NIV would say. All about male leadership in the church. And some would read this and say, some would interpret this as a woman couldn't take authority, but if it's given to her, she could be the lead pastor of a church. And here's the reality, that's true. Some could interpret it that way. Now, let me say some very brief things about this verse in particular. Number one, I don't love this translation. I wish they would have stuck with it. But I don't love it for theological reasons, not textual reasons. The way they translated it is a fair translation. It truly is fair. So I want to hesitate to be very critical about it because that's a fair translation. In fact, here's, the outlandish critics of the NIV say that it's a feminist translation, that they're trying to break down male leadership in the home and the church. Here's the reality. That's exactly the way Calvin translated that verse in German. So if you're going to accuse Calvin of having a agenda, I don't think you could do this church, all right? That's just not true. This is a fair translation, but theologically, I don't like it. But know this, that truly is the hottest controversy about this translation. No translation's perfect. I think the NIV has made a lot of improvements. There's, according to one of the papers of a guy that I read, Rod Decker's paper, there's probably 3 places that we wish, from our theological perspective, they would have done it differently. And when we come to those, believe me, we'll talk about them. Those are the issues surrounding the NIV. There's a couple conclusions I want to make sure I get, so let me say this and then be done. Number 1, thanks for letting me dive deep today. I mean, we're diving deep. This church is all about more and better disciples. And let me tell you, when it comes to teaching on Sunday mornings, most Sundays I try to teach towards more disciples and better disciples. On occasion, I focus only on more, that we want to see more people come to Christ. Coming up in a few weeks on Easter Sunday, it'll be really geared towards more. And every once in a while, I'm going to focus exclusively on better, that those who don't know Christ may be thoroughly confused. You may be brand new today and think, I really didn't know if I understood that. This is not a typical Sunday. So thank you, church, for letting me dive deep on this. See, here's the reality. This Bible is the one we're going to use for the foreseeable future. So which one we use is really, really important. And this gives you a place that you could point people to. Our website, when people ask us, we could point. Secondly, I would urge you, get your copy of the 2011 NIV. I would urge you to have one. I would love you to bring it with you on Sunday mornings. I would love you to take it to your small group with you. But I would urge you to get one. We have some in the bookstore. You can buy them online. The NIV 2011, get your copy. The stewardship team in a little under 2 weeks is going to have their next meeting where they're going to talk about those chair Bibles. We have to replace them. But to replace those chair Bibles, to put one in every other chair, is going to cost us almost $4,000. So that's not something we budgeted for. So we got to figure that out. And in a budget where we're running, $50,000 behind, we got to figure out when can we do that? When's the wise time for that? But you should get one. From now on, from next Sunday on, what appears on the screen is going to be the 2011. I will keep using the 84 edition until we can change them in the chairs because of our target. We want people who come and they don't maybe have a Bible and they use one of the chairs, which is great. So I want to use whatever they're going to hold in their hands. We'll be replacing that soon. I want to remind you, you may have a preference. You may say, I don't need help in knowing that alien is a foreigner. I don't need help to know Jesus was born of Mary. I don't need help to know that a saint isn't, an honored dead Catholic. I don't need help with that. I get all that. But that probably means you've been around the Bible for a while. So we want to think about those that haven't been around the Bible for a while. That's the NIV target, and that's our target as a church. So it's the best fit for us. And that's why we ask our teachers. All of our teachers are required to teach from the NIV. All of our small group leaders, we request that they use the NIV. And it's really up to you. There's really no issue with whatever translation you enjoy, use it. I would encourage you to think about a pi-squared life when you choose your translation. When you begin to pray, invest, and invite, and someone in your sphere of influence comes to Christ, what's the best translation for you to use in discipling them and helping them? Some of you have been in small groups where people have been reading, you read around a circle, and someone reads the translation, and someone else says, I don't even know what that guy just said. And they're looking at their Bible saying, what am I missing here? That's why sometimes it's nice. Use whatever you want personally. I think all the translations we've talked about are good. Here's what I know for sure, and let me end with this thought. The issue to me is not what translation you use, what translation you read from, or what translation you study from. The issue we have here is, are you listening to God's word to you? We have an advantage in the last 600 years that people didn't have in the first 1,600 years of church history. And that is the ability to read the Bible for ourselves. That's the real issue. On issues of translation, let's show grace. If we're going to err on one side or the other, let's err on the side of grace. But most importantly, may all of us be people who listen carefully to what God says to us through his word. God, thank you. Thank you that you have given us your word and the reality that because we have your word, this is actually a debate. This is actually a choice we have to make, and it's not an easy choice. God, let me specifically ask you for a few things. One, I ask that you would help those that have a strong preference on an issue, that we would all be gracious to each other. Secondly, God, I ask for those who have come here today, it's their first time, they're just checking this thing out, they're kicking the tires of Christianity. I pray that you would help them to understand where we are. We're diving deep, that they would capture the greatness of who you are, that your word is so important to us, we actually talk about these things. And God, I pray more than anything else that all of us here would be people that hear and respond to your word for your glory and certainly for our eternal good. Amen. I think our deepest longing is that we would be people that would be so longing to please God that his word impacts our lives every day. So regardless of where you land on translation, I guess I hope that a sermon like this is simply a reminder of the centrality of God's word to us, that it's through his word that he changes our lives. And we need to be devoted to him by being devoted to his word and responding to it. Would you please stand? I just want to remind you, tonight, of course, is our vertical worship at 6 o'clock. And also, if you filled out one of those connections cards but you didn't get it in the offering basket, you could stop at the info desk and drop it in the box. As always, one of our pastors is down front, and Nate will be down here and be able to talk to him if you have spiritually oriented questions. Let me pray. God, thank you that you change our lives through your spirit, your word, and your people. God, let us be people that take those seriously and that we dive into it for our good, our joy, and our change, and that best glorifies and pleases you. For it is for the sake of your fame and your renown that we long to be changed in the image of Jesus. I pray that in his name. Amen. God bless you. See you next week.